Fought for 13's Chapter 1. The Frigid Grip of the Bering Sea. The Bering Sea stretched out like an endless void, a merciless expanse where the boundary between life and death was as fragile as the thin layer of ice forming on the decks of the vessels that dared to challenge it. It was January 15, 2025, though the date meant little out here. Time was measured in hauls, storms, and the relentless tick of survival. The air bit with a ferocity that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, temperatures plummeting to 10 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Winds screamed across the waves at 40 knots, whipping the sea into foaming crests that towered like the skyscrapers of distant cities, only to crash down with bone-jarring force. This was no place for the weak-hearted. It was the deadliest fishing ground on Earth, where king crab fishermen gambled their lives for a bounty that could either secure their futures or drag them into the abyss. At the heart of this chaos was the Northern Star, a weathered 70-foot crab boat forged in the shipyards of Seattle back in the 1980s. Her hull, once gleaming with fresh paint, was now a patchwork of scars, dents from rogue waves, rust from endless salt spray, and welds from hasty repairs in Dutch Harbor. She was built tough, with a reinforced steel frame designed to withstand the Bering's fury. But even the sturdiest vessels had their limits. The Northern Star had seen better days. Her engines grumbled like an old man protesting the cold, and her hydraulics wheezed with every lift of the massive crab pots. Yet she pressed on, her lights cutting through the impenetrable darkness like desperate beacons signaling for mercy that the sea rarely granted. Captain Elias Reed stood resolute at the helm in the wheelhouse, his gloved hands gripping the wheel with the familiarity of a lifelong companion. At 55 years old, Reed was a man carved from the same unforgiving elements that surrounded him. His face was a rugged map of experience, deep lines etched around his steel-gray eyes from squinting into horizons blurred by fog and spray, a jagged scar running down his left cheek from a hook mishap in '02, and a beard streaked with white that he hadn't bothered to trim since the season started. Salt had permeated his very being. It crusted his oilskins, flavored his coffee, and lingered in his dreams. Reed had been at sea since he was 16, dropping out of high school in Kodiak to follow his father's footsteps. The ocean was in his blood, but it had taken its toll. He'd lost his younger brother Micah to these waters back in 1995, a freak rogue wave that capsized their boat during a routine haul. Micah's body was never recovered, just a life vest washing up on the shores of the Aleutians weeks later. Every trip out here was a ritual of remembrance for Reed, a silent vow to outsmart the sea that had claimed his kin. He chain-smoked Marlboros to steady his nerves, the glow of the cigarette tip the only warmth in the chilled cabin. "Steady on course, 58 degrees north, 170 west," Reed muttered to himself, his voice a low gravel that cut through the hum of the engines. The GPS screen flickered in the dim light, plotting their position amid a grid of known hazards, sunken wrecks, submerged ridges, and the ever-shifting ice flows. Tonight was the final push of the season. The hold below decks was already half full of wriggling king crabs, their massive legs clacking against the metal tanks in a symphony of potential profit. Each crab was worth its weight in gold. A full load could fetch tens of thousands in Dutch Harbor, enough to pay off debts, fix the boat, and maybe even take a winter off. But Reed knew better than to count the haul before it was docked. "One more string of pots," he growled into the VHF radio, his breath fogging the microphone. "Then we're ghosts in the wind, boys. Rich ghosts." The crew responded with grunts and nods, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine forged in the fires of adversity. First mate Jake Harper was Reed's right hand, a 40-year-old powerhouse from Seattle with a build like a linebacker and a temperament as steady as the North Star itself. Jake was the family man of the group, married to his high school sweetheart, Emily, with 2 kids, a boy of 12 who dreamed of being a pilot, and a girl of 8 who collected seashells from the stories her dad told. Every paycheck Jake wired home was a lifeline, covering the mortgage on their modest house and the braces for little Sarah. He wore a silver locket around his neck with their photos inside, a talisman against the isolation of the sea. Jake handled the hydraulics with expert precision, his calloused hands adjusting valves and lines without a second thought. He'd been with Reed for 8 seasons, earning his trust through storms that would break lesser men. "Pots are baited and ready, Cap. Let's drop them and get this over with," Jake called up from the deck, his voice carrying over the wind. Working alongside Jake was Ryan Cole, the 28-year-old deckhand who lived for the adrenaline. Ryan was a transplant from the North Sea oil rigs, where he'd spent his early 20s dangling from platforms hundreds of feet above churning waves, fixing machinery in conditions that made the Bering seem tame by comparison. With a mop of unruly blonde hair tucked under a wool cap and tattoos peeking from his sleeves, anchors, waves, and a skull grinning defiantly, he was the thrill-seeker of the crew. Ryan chased danger like others chased paychecks. For him, the roar of the waves and the sting of the cold were highs better than any drug. "Hell yeah, let's hook some monsters," he shouted as he stuffed the 800-pound steel crab pots with herring heads and cod scraps. The pots were massive cages, 7 feet square, designed to lure the king crabs from the depths with the promise of easy meals. Ryan's energy was infectious, keeping morale up even as the temperature dropped and fatigue set in. Then there was Lisa Marco, the 35-year-old ex-Navy diver and the only woman aboard. She was a force of nature, her compact frame belying a strength honed from years of underwater operations in the Persian Gulf in the Arctic. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hazel eyes missed nothing, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble, checking lines for frays, anticipating the sea's next move. She joined the Navy right out of college, specializing in salvage dives and explosive ordnance disposal, but a shoulder injury from a botched op had forced her into civilian life. Crab fishing was her way of staying connected to the water, proving she could still thrive in the male-dominated world of the Bering. Liza baited pots with efficient motions, her gloved hands moving like a surgeon's. "Watch the tension on that line, Ryan," she warned, her voice calm but authoritative. "Last thing we need is a snap in this wind." Rounding out the crew was the greenhorn, Timothy "Tim" Lee, a 23-year-old kid from Anchorage making his first run on the Bering. He was all wide eyes and eager energy, his lanky frame bundled in layers of thermals and oilskins that made him look even younger. He'd grown up hearing tales of crab fortunes from his uncle, a retired fisherman, and had dropped out of community college to chase the dream. Proving himself was everything to Tim. He stacked pots on the deck with a determination that bordered on frenzy, ignoring the ache in his muscles and the numbness in his fingers. "I'm good, guys. Let's fill this boat," he yelled, though his voice cracked slightly from the cold. The veterans watched him closely. Greenhorns were often the first to crack under pressure, but Tim had a spark that might just carry him through. As the Northern Star plowed forward, the deck was a hive of activity. The crew worked in rhythm, baiting the pots, attaching buoys, and preparing the lines for deployment. The hydraulics hummed as the crane lifted each cage over the rail, dropping them into the black water with a splash that sent icy spray flying. The lines uncoiled smoothly, sinking to 200 feet where the king crab scuttled across the muddy seabed. Buoys bobbed on the surface, marking the string like sentinels in the fog. Patchy mist rolled in from the Aleutians, reducing visibility to a mile, turning the world into a ghostly haze, punctuated by the boat's lights. VHF radio chatter crackled intermittently, connecting the Northern Star to her sister ships in the fleet. The Iron Fury out of Nome and the Wavebreaker from Kodiak were plying the same grounds, their captains exchanging weather updates and catch reports to stave off the crushing isolation. "Storm building from the north, boys," came the gruff voice of the Iron Fury's skipper. "Winds picking up to 50 knots by dawn. Haul fast if you want to beat it." Reed acknowledged with a curt grunt, his eyes fixed on the sonar screen. The display showed a clear bottom, no obstacles in their path, but the Bering was full of secrets, and not all wrecks were charted. Unseen and unknown, 300 feet below the surface, a forgotten relic from a bygone era stirred in the depths. It was no ordinary wreck. This was the submersible escape pod from Project Abyss, a classified Soviet deep-sea experiment launched in the twilight years of the USSR around 1992. The project had been the brainchild of a team of rogue scientists in Murmansk, driven by the crumbling empire's desperation for a biological edge in the Cold War's lingering shadows. They had plumbed the Hadal zones, depths exceeding 20,000 feet, where hydrothermal vents spewed superheated water laced with exotic microbes. From these hellish fissures, they harvested the virulent abyss strain, or VAS, a mutagenic virus unlike anything on the surface. VAS was a microscopic nightmare, capable of rewriting DNA in hours, turning infected cells into feral hybrids, gills on fish sprouting legs, and krill developing armored exoskeletons, and in lab trials on rats, horrors that made the researchers question their sanity. The pod itself was a marvel of Soviet engineering, a titanium sphere roughly the size of a small car, reinforced to withstand pressures that would crush a submarine. It housed frozen vials of VAS in cryogenic storage, along with data logs and emergency beacons. But disaster had struck during the extraction phase aboard the mother sub, the K-278. A hull breach,